Big round of applause for Heather.
So this story, I sent Michael a message. I said I want to talk to you about the time that my grandmother kidnapped her grandchildren and fled the state and crossed 2 state lines and was wanted by the law. Because that's really an awesome story. And the more I thought about it, I was thinking about the story, and it just devolved into something that I didn't really expect. So just a little warning, this is not really a story about my grandmother's escape from the law. Kind of is. It's more about a more difficult subject that is a painful part of my family history. So starting off, you need to know my uncle was an addict, and my grandmother lived with that pain, that intractable, soul-killing pain for most of his life. And as part of his path of destruction, the 2 good things that came out of this were my cousins, his daughters, Faith and Joy, who are wonderful, wonderful girls. Their mother, he duped into marrying him because she lived in the Philippines and didn't know better. So in the wake of his drug addict stupidity, he really messed things up. And my grandmother felt at the time that the best thing to do would be to take those 2 girls and flee in order to speed up the wheels of justice on their behalf, knowing full well that the repercussions for her were going to be pretty hideous. So she did. She went from Orlando to Jackson, Tennessee. What you need to know about Jackson, Tennessee, my grandmother, is that she lived for most of her life in a town where and this is the painful part, where respectable men wore white shirts to Sunday church and wore white sheets to Saturday meetings. And the words that were used in common vernacular were quite ugly. You're familiar with them. The proper term, if you weren't going to use the ugly words, was colored. And so this was a part of her life, a part of the way that she grew up. So for her to fall in love with her grandchildren, who were not white, was a part of her growth process. And for her to risk her life, her well-being for these children by risking being arrested was for her not a non-issue. Because in the time that she grew up, from the time that she was small and this was a normal part of her life, to the time that she was a grandmother, where she started to see this is not the way life should be, there was a lot of growth that happened. So she fled the state. We all gathered together to say, what are we going to do about this situation? And she was going from house to house, from relative to relative, trying to evade the law because they knew she was in town. And somebody thought it was a great idea to go see The Fugitive, which we're sitting in the theater, our guts wrenching, saying, oh, yeah, this is really great. We're sitting in a dark theater, hiding from the law, watching Harrison Ford run from the law, and not doing anything. So anyway, long story short, there was a lot to that situation that was just messed up and horrible, and a testament to don't do drugs. But these kids are wonderful. They're fantastic. They've grown up into lovely human beings, and I think that that's largely in part to the fact that my grandmother took the risks for her, partnered with my aunt, Eulalia, who was from the Philippines, and they two together conquered the influence of addiction in my family. But later on, after I drove back with my children and my Aunt Yoli's children to Orlando to return the children to her, my grandmother had to go through the process. They didn't press charges. My grandmother and my aunt had developed this relationship, and it was just this huge, horrible thing that we all had to go through together. But part of that process is my grandmother had to spend some time in jail. And so she turned herself in, knowing full well that that's what she would have to do ultimately. And as part of that process, You turn yourself in, you remove all your clothing, they bathe you, they check various parts of your body in the most humiliating way ever. And they put you in a group of people that you don't know, that are not the type of people that you normally associate with. And she was scared to death. She was mortified of all the things that she had to go through, but knowing it was worth it. And she said she was in this place, and she walked in, and there was all these people, and they were the type of people that are scary to most people. And she sat down, and she was wet, and she was cold, and this woman came up to her, and she said, "Heather, I looked at her, and I thought, my life is going to end here." This woman was very tall. She was very muscular. She was very black. She was very scary looking to my grandmother. And my grandmother's, she said, I was shivering, I was so cold. And this woman walked up to me, and she took off her shirt, literally left her bra on, took off her shirt and wrapped it around my grandmother. And she sat there with her arm around my grandmother as if daring anyone else to touch her, and she protected her. And at that point in my grandmother's life, she had progressed so far from being in that small, closed-minded town to being in this situation with a guardian angel who looked like someone she never would have associated with when she was a child. And she shared with me, she said, that was the most beautiful thing, and I'm so grateful for that person. And what I took away from that and sharing this information with my grandmother, this story with my grandmother, is that there was a huge legacy of racism in my family. I have a large branch of my family that grew up that way. That was normal, that was right, that was the way it was. There was them and there was us. And it didn't matter who them was, as long as they weren't white, they were them. And my grandmother, in her lifetime, went from that place to a place of, this is where it ends. This is where racism ends in our family. And I'm so grateful to her for that. And I think that it's important for all of us to examine ourselves, because we pick up things, we learn things from our parents, and things change, times change. I think it's important, as my grandmother did, to always examine yourself and say, am I really as progressive as I think I am? Do I really have all of my ducks in a row as far as my relationship with my fellow man? Because we are all one race, one person, one being.